Clint Eastwood's action thrillers, the other side of the legend. When people think Clint Eastwood, they picture the squinting cowboy, the rugged drifter with a poncho draped across his shoulders, silently stalking the dusty streets of frontier towns. It's an image burned into cinema history, the lone rider who needed only a look to silence a crowd. But what if that's only half the story? Because after the cowboy hat came off, Eastwood didn't retire into legend. He reloaded and stepped into the modern world. Suddenly, he wasn't just facing outlaws with six-shooters. He was battling assassins, corrupt cops, prison walls, even the ticking clock of the Cold War. This was Clint Eastwood beyond the saddle, the era when he traded wide-open plains for cramped city streets, traded revolvers for .44 Magnums, and swapped silent standoffs for explosive confrontations that redefined Hollywood action. And here's the twist. Many of these films became just as influential, maybe even more than his westerns. Dirty Harry didn't just make Eastwood a superstar, it reshaped the entire cop movie genre. Escape from Alcatraz wasn't just a prison break film, it made audiences believe the impossible could happen. And In the Line of Fire showed that even in his 60s, Clint could headline thrillers with the energy of a man half his age. So tonight, we're stepping into Clint Eastwood's other world, the one where he wasn't riding into town, but running into danger. From the streets of San Francisco to the iron bars of Alcatraz, from espionage in Moscow to presidential assassination plots in Washington, these are the action thrillers that built the other half of Clint Eastwood's legend. By the late 1960s, Clint Eastwood had conquered the Western. The Man with No Name trilogy with Sergio Leone had catapulted him from TV star to international icon. Hang 'em High 1968 and Two Mules for Sister Sarah 1970 proved his draw at the American box office. But the question loomed, could he survive outside the saddle? Hollywood wasn't sure. Studios typecast. They liked their stars in neat boxes. John Wayne was the cowboy. Humphrey Bogart was the tough city detective. Cary Grant was the suave gentleman. Eastwood, he was the Western guy, and audiences loved him that way. But Clint saw something different. He knew that if he stayed in the desert forever, his career might wither once Westerns lost steam. And by the late 60s, the genre was already starting to fade. He needed a pivot. That pivot came with Coogan's Bluff, 1968, directed by Don Siegel, the same man who would later shape Dirty Harry. This film was Clint's first real test outside the West. He played Walt Coogan, an Arizona deputy sent to New York City to extradite a fugitive. It sounds simple, but on screen, it was jarring. Suddenly, audiences saw Clint Eastwood, not in a cowboy hat, not with a horse or dusty boots, but striding through modern New York streets in a suit. No poncho, no saloon doors, just a straight-faced lawman out of place in a city of chaos. And here's what made it work. Coogan's Bluff was essentially a Western in disguise. Clint was still the outsider, still the man enforcing justice his own way, still clashing with authority. Only this time, instead of a corrupt sheriff or outlaw gang, he was battling city bureaucrats and urban criminals. Audiences noticed. Critics were split. Some thought Clint looked uncomfortable in the modern world. Others praised the raw toughness he carried into the role. But the box office was decent, and more importantly, it planted a seed. Clint could work outside the Western. What few people knew at the time was how important this partnership with Don Siegel would become. The two men clicked. Siegel understood Clint's quiet intensity, his minimalist acting style. He knew how to frame him, how to let silence do the talking. And together, they would go on to craft some of Clint's greatest non-Western hits. Coogan's Bluff wasn't the blockbuster that changed everything, but it was the bridge, the proof of concept. It told audiences, Clint Eastwood isn't just a cowboy. He's a lawman who can walk any street in any era. And that lesson would explode just a few years later, when Clint traded the desert for San Francisco and picked up a .44 Magnum. In 1971, Clint Eastwood strapped on a holster again, but this time it wasn't a six-shooter, and it wasn't the Old West. It was San Francisco. It was the 1970s, and Clint was about to introduce the world to Harry Callahan, the cop who made justice personal. Dirty Harry wasn't just another police thriller. It was a cultural earthquake. The moment Harry walked onto the screen, revolver in hand, audiences knew this was different. He wasn't charming, he wasn't by the book, and he definitely wasn't soft. Harry Callahan was hard, unflinching, and more dangerous than the criminals he hunted. And then came the line. the one that turned a film into legend.
You've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?
That line, delivered with Eastwood's cold squint and deliberate pause, became the most quoted moment of the decade. Suddenly, Clint Eastwood wasn't just the cowboy anymore. He was the face of the American cop, uncompromising, violent, and endlessly quotable. But Dirty Harry was controversial. Critics and politicians slammed the movie for glorifying vigilante justice. Was Harry a hero standing up against a broken system, or a fascist cop who trampled civil rights? The debate was loud, and it never really ended. Some cities even protested screenings, accusing Eastwood of selling revenge fantasies. And yet audiences flocked to it. The film smashed box offices, not because Harry was a role model, but because he tapped into a raw frustration. America in the early 70s was gripped by rising crime rates, distrust of government, and a fear that institutions couldn't protect the average citizen. Harry Callahan was the answer, a man who ignored red tape and got things done, no matter the cost. Of course, Hollywood saw gold. 4 sequels followed. Magnum Force, 1973, where Harry faced off against vigilante cops. The Enforcer, 1976, which introduced Tyne Daly as his rookie partner. Sudden Impact, 1983, where Clint delivered his other iconic catchphrase,
Go ahead. Make my day.
And finally, The Deadpool, 1988, which pushed the character into the late 80s action era. Each sequel expanded the myth of Harry Callahan, and through it all, Eastwood never softened him. Harry was never warm, never polite, never politically correct. He was raw, unfiltered, and dangerously effective. The influence, massive. Every gritty cop movie that came after, from Charles Bronson's Death Wish to Mel Gibson's Lethal Weapon, owes a debt to Dirty Harry. Even modern anti-heroes like Jack Bauer in 24 and Batman in The Dark Knight carry Harry's DNA. Clint Eastwood had done it again. First he reinvented the Western. Now, he had reinvented the cop thriller. And just like before, he left audiences asking, was this man a savior or a warning? After Harry Callahan cemented Clint as Hollywood's toughest cop, Eastwood looked for new challenges, and he found them in stories of survival, roles where brute force wasn't enough, where brains, willpower, and sheer endurance mattered more than a loaded gun. The standout? Escape from Alcatraz, 1979. Based on the true story of Frank Morris, the film followed the infamous 1962 escape from America's most secure prison. For decades, Alcatraz was considered inescapable. Its walls were steel, its guards ruthless, its location surrounded by icy, shark-infested waters. The government swore nobody could break free, but Clint Eastwood made audiences believe otherwise. The film, directed once again by Don Siegel, was stripped down, quiet, almost clinical in its tension. There were no big shootouts, no flashy explosions, just the slow, methodical planning of men desperate to outwit the system. And Clint, with his trademark calm and piercing stare, embodied the kind of man who could do the impossible. The movie ends ambiguously. We never see Frank Morris escape the island. History says the escapees likely drowned, but the film leaves it open. Maybe they made it, maybe they didn't. And that ambiguity became the movie's power. For decades, people debated whether the real escapees survived, and Clint Eastwood's performance kept that mystery alive. But survival wasn't always about escaping prisons. In The Eiger Sanction, 1975, Eastwood played an assassin forced into one last job, climbing the treacherous Eiger Mountain in Switzerland to kill a fellow climber. Part thriller, part mountaineering epic, the film pushed Clint into physical danger for real. He actually performed many of his own climbing stunts, dangling thousands of feet above the ground. At one point, he nearly died during production when a rock dislodged and almost knocked him off the cliff. These films showed another side of Clint's action persona, not just the gunfighter or the cop, but the survivor, the man who could face impossible odds, and whether by cunning, toughness, or sheer will, come out alive. And that's what kept audiences glued to him. Whether it was escaping an unbreakable prison or scaling an unclimbable mountain, Clint Eastwood sold the idea that nothing was beyond reach. If he was on the screen, there was always a chance. By the end of the 70s, Clint wasn't just the cowboy and the cop. He was the man who could survive anything. By the 1980s, Clint Eastwood was no longer just America's cop or Hollywood survivor. He was now stepping into a new battlefield, the Cold War. The Soviet Union loomed large in pop culture, and Hollywood was obsessed with spies, nuclear weapons, and high-tech standoffs between East and West. Clint, always one to sense the moment, decided to dive in. The result was Firefox 1982. On paper, it sounded wild. Clint Eastwood, a Vietnam veteran turned pilot, sneaking into Moscow to steal a next-generation Soviet fighter jet that could outfly anything in the world. It wasn't a dusty western town. It wasn't a San Francisco back alley. It was espionage at the height of Cold War paranoia. For audiences, the shift was shocking. Eastwood was suddenly navigating shadowy KGB agents, disguises, and coded messages. But beneath all the spy thriller trappings, it still worked because Clint played it the way he always had, as the lone man against impossible odds. Firefox was ambitious too. Clint directed the film himself, and it featured some of the most expensive special effects of its time. The climactic jet sequences were state-of-the-art, with Eastwood strapped into a futuristic cockpit as missiles streaked through the skies. It wasn't just an action movie, it was a statement that Clint could keep up with the blockbuster era of the 80s, and yet Clint never leaned into James Bond glamour. There were no tuxedos, no martinis, no quippy one-liners. His spy work was gritty, stripped down, and tense. In one scene, Clint's character Gant has to think in Russian to operate the jet's weapons system, a clever twist that made the audience sweat alongside him. The Cold War setting also gave Clint a new kind of enemy. The outlaws of the Old West and the punks of San Francisco were familiar foes. But here, he was going head-to-head with the Soviet Union, the geopolitical villain of the decade. It broadened his canvas, showing that Clint's brand of lone wolf determination wasn't limited to America's borders. But Firefox wasn't just about Clint surviving. It was about him adapting. The cowboy could ride a horse, the cop could fire a .44 Magnum, but now the action hero could also fly a high-tech stealth jet. The message was clear. Clint Eastwood was timeless, a man who could fit into any era, any threat, any war, even the shadow battles of global superpowers. It didn't hurt that the movie was released right when America's anxieties about Soviet dominance were peaking. In theaters, audiences weren't just cheering Clint, they were cheering the idea that one American, even a fictional one, could outwit the USSR. So by the time Clint soared across the big screen in a stolen Soviet fighter, the transformation was complete. The cowboy had officially gone global. If Firefox was Clint Eastwood embracing the global Cold War, Tightrope 1984 brought him crashing back to Earth and right into the moral gray areas of American policing. In this film, Clint wasn't Harry Callahan. He wasn't the unshakable cop who always knew right from wrong. Instead, he played Wes Block, a New Orleans detective tracking a serial killer. But Block wasn't just fighting criminals, he was fighting himself. Unlike Harry, Block was vulnerable, flawed, haunted. He prowled seedy corners of the city, sometimes blurring the line between the hunter and the hunted. The killer's perversions echoed Block's own hidden desires, forcing him and the audience to confront just how thin the line was between protector and predator. For Clint, this was bold. He'd built his image on control, on being the man who never flinched, never doubted, never broke. But Tightrope ripped that open. Suddenly, Eastwood was showing weakness, temptation, even darkness. It wasn't about a superhero cop anymore. It was about a man drowning in the same moral swamp as the criminals he chased. And audiences noticed. The film was a critical success, praised for its psychological depth and its willingness to peel back Eastwood's tough guy mask. Critics who once dismissed him as one-dimensional suddenly had to admit Clint could act, really act. But Clint being Clint, he didn't abandon Harry Callahan either. In the same decade, he brought Harry back in Sudden Impact 1983, where he delivered another immortal line, "Go ahead, make my day." That phrase echoed through pop culture, repeated by politicians, comedians, and everyone in between. President Ronald Reagan even used it in a speech, cementing Eastwood's words in the American political lexicon. The balance was fascinating. On one hand, you had Harry Callahan, the ultimate power fantasy of the unbending cop. On the other, you had Wes Block, a man cracking under the same pressures, showing the human cost of being that tough for too long. Together, these roles gave Clint a dimension no other action star of the era had. By the late 80s, Clint rounded out his cop thriller run with The Deadpool. It wasn't the strongest entry, but it did have a young Jim Carrey in one of his earliest roles, playing a rock star. The movie also featured Clint blowing up a car with a rocket launcher, a sign that even he wasn't immune to the excesses of 80s action cinema. But what mattered most was this. Clint Eastwood, the cowboy of the 60s, had become the cop of the 70s, and by the 80s, he was the action veteran who could do both. And instead of fading out, he was preparing for yet another reinvention, one that would prove he wasn't slowing down, even as he crossed into his 60s. By the 1990s, Clint Eastwood was supposed to be winding down. Most actors his age were fading into side roles, playing mentors, fathers, or simply retiring altogether. Clint was in his 60s. He'd already carried 2 decades of action thrillers, and was directing more frequently. Conventional wisdom said his time as a box office star was finished, and then came In the Line of Fire, 1993. This was the movie that proved Clint Eastwood wasn't done, not even close. Directed by Wolfgang Peterson, the film cast Eastwood as Frank Horrigan, a Secret Service agent, haunted by his failure to protect President John F. Kennedy decades earlier. Now in the 90s, he finds himself facing a brilliant, unhinged assassin, played with chilling brilliance by John Malkovich, who's plotting another presidential killing. The setup alone was electric, but what really made the film powerful was Eastwood's performance. Frank Horrigan wasn't Harry Callahan. He wasn't unbreakable. He wasn't always right. He was older, worn down, carrying guilt, and sometimes even doubting his own abilities. But that vulnerability made him compelling. For audiences, it was refreshing, even shocking. Here was Clint Eastwood, the man who once never flinched, openly showing cracks in his armor. He was still tough, still sharp, but human in a way Harry Callahan never allowed himself to be. And the chemistry between Eastwood and Malkovich was dynamite, a cat-and-mouse game that elevated the whole thriller. Critics hailed it as one of the best performances of Eastwood's career, and the box office agreed. In the Line of Fire grossed over $180 million worldwide, proving that even in his 60s, Clint could headline a blockbuster thriller, but he didn't stop there. In Absolute Power, 1997, Clint played a master thief who accidentally witnesses a crime committed by the President of the United States. Once again, Clint found himself facing an institution bigger than any outlaw or criminal, the American government itself. It was a clever twist on his loner persona, a man who lived outside the law, forced into a battle against the most powerful lawmaker of them all. Then came True Crime, 1999, where Clint played a journalist racing against time to prove a death row inmate's innocence. It wasn't as iconic as his earlier thrillers, but it showed his willingness to tackle stories about justice in more complex, less black and white ways. And in 2002, Clint gave one more performance in the thriller mold with Bloodwork. He played an FBI profiler recovering from a heart transplant, who's called back into service to solve a murder. By this point, Eastwood was 72 years old, yet he carried the role with a quiet intensity that few younger actors could match. What all these films proved was simple. Clint Eastwood had mastered reinvention. In the 90s and early 2000s, he stopped trying to play the unbreakable cop or cowboy. Instead, he leaned into his age, into vulnerability, into characters shaped by years of mistakes, regrets, and second chances. And that shift didn't weaken his legend, it strengthened it. Because if his westerns were about youth and grit, and his Dirty Harry years were about toughness and defiance, then his 90s thrillers were about resilience, about carrying scars, but still showing up when it mattered. And for many fans, that made this era some of his most relatable and unforgettable work. Clint Eastwood's career is often summed up in a single image, the cowboy riding off into the sunset. And yes, that's where his legend began. But if you only stop there, you're missing half the story. Because Clint Eastwood wasn't just the man of the West. He was also the man of the city, the prison yard, the mountaintop, the Cold War skies, and the political battlefield. He carried the DNA of the lone outsider into every era, every genre, every impossible situation. The westerns gave him myth, but the action thrillers gave him edge. They proved his silence could terrify just as much in San Francisco as it did in the desert. They proved his stare could cut through Soviet agents as easily as it once cut through bandits. And they proved his voice, low, measured, and commanding, could still define an entire genre, decades after the poncho came off. Think about it. Dirty Harry didn't just change Eastwood's career. It changed the way Hollywood told stories about cops, crime, and justice. Escape from Alcatraz didn't just tell a prison break story. It cemented a mystery that people still argue about today. In the Line of Fire didn't just show an aging agent fighting an assassin. It redefined what an older action star could be. Vulnerable, flawed, but still magnetic. And here's the twist. These roles didn't erase his Western image. They completed it. They made him bigger than one genre, bigger than one icon. He wasn't just the cowboy. He wasn't just the cop. He was Clint Eastwood, the man who proved a single persona could stretch across decades, cultures, and film styles without breaking. Maybe that's why his legend has lasted so long, because he wasn't trapped in the frontier. he wasn't limited to one kind of role. He reinvented himself over and over, and every time he did, he created another classic, another icon, another reason for audiences to lean forward in their seats when he appeared on screen. So yes, Clint Eastwood's westerns built his legend, but his action thrillers, they kept it alive. They carried it into the modern world, into new generations, into conversations far beyond Hollywood. And maybe that's the lesson. The cowboy can ride forever, if he knows how to change his horse. And that's the untold story of Clint Eastwood's action thrillers, the films that proved the cowboy never really hung up his gun. He just found new battlefields. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to check out our Clint Eastwood Westerns video, where we dive into the 12 or maybe 15 films that started it all. And stay tuned because we're not done yet. Next up, we'll explore Clint's most surprising side, his comedies and musicals. Yes, the toughest man in Hollywood once sang in a Western musical and co-starred with an orangutan. You won't want to miss it. Until then, let me know in the comments, which Clint Eastwood thriller is your favorite? Dirty Harry with his .44 Magnum? Frank Morris breaking out of Alcatraz? Or Frank Horrigan outsmarting John Malkovich in The Line of Fire? Drop your answer below. And as always, thanks for watching.